I'd like to thank the Groton Public Library for having me here. It's the third time in nearly as many months. It's a good thing that these are double-door exits, or else I might have a hard time getting my head through there, I suppose, from all the compliments that Jean has paid me here. It's the perfect time of year, I think, finally, to talk about gardening and flowers. How many people here like to garden? Okay, all right. How many people here hate gardening but do it anyway? Yeah, all right. I have to tell you right from the outset, all right, I'm going to be clear on this, that I'm not a gardener. I don't know a hyacinth from a hip replacement, but I do know a good story. And a good story takes a good character. And Beatrix Farrand was a very interesting character. And she helped change the way that gardens look in America, from the most formal all the way down to probably your very own. So, let me commence with another story that leads up to her. In January of 1899, Samuel Parsons Jr., a designer of New York City's Union Square and Morningside Park, called a meeting of fellow prominent American landscape architects to form a national society. Now, among them at this meeting was Warren H. Manning, who was an early advocate of the national park system, and cousins John Charles and Frederick Law Olmsted, Jr. These are the dynastic heirs to the revered father of American landscape architecture and the co-designer of Central Park, Frederick Law Olmsted, who you see on the bottom right here. I'm sure you've all heard of Frederick Law Olmsted. Now, this gathering that was a very headstrong bunch of guys, given to strong differences of opinion over the aesthetic functions of gardens and whether the private residential variety, and you can see Frederick Law Olmsted's own house right here in Brookline, Mass, not Brooklyn, New York, Brookline, Mass down here. Whether or not the private residential variety deserved the kind of attention and professional landscape design work that was the typical purview of the grand public open space. So these guys were the ones who designed enormous parks and great public areas, and cities would hire them, and municipalities would hire them to do world fairs and things like that. These grand scale designs. So while they took their work seriously, they apparently knew how to relax now and then, as you can see up there on this is Frederick Law Olmsted's office, his office staff. Maybe after a couple of gin and tonics at the end of the day, I don't know what they're doing up there. But in any event, the one thing that all these guys, all these old boys agreed on, was that a young and up-and-coming gardener should be included as the sole female founding member of the fledgling American Society of Landscape Architects, and that woman was Beatrix Farrand. Now, she was born Beatrix Cadwallader Jones into upper-class New York society in 1872. Now, Farrand's blood was as blue as it comes. She had Revolutionary War ancestors on both sides of the family. Her patrician background and her connections probably had something to do with her inclusion in the ASLA, this new society. Considering her age, she was only 26, and her gender, because landscape design, as I said, was an old boy network. It was all men who were doing this at the time. Now, among her influential relations was her aunt, Edith Wharton, who you see up on the top here, and she was also the darling of Henry James, the writer Henry James, a rather scary-looking fellow down here, who was, of course, one of America's preeminent writers at the time, and he was a regular visitor to the house, and she would come down as a little girl and dance around and amuse him. And so, anyway, so she had very influential connections. But she also had the right professional credentials. Like many young ladies of her class, she did the grand European tour to round out her formal education and visited many of Europe's notable gardens in both England and Italy. She studied under Charles Sprague Sargent, who was the cousin of the painter John Singer Sargent, and who was the founder and first director of Boston's Arnold Arboretum. And while in England, she met and spent time with the famous English gardener Gertrude Jekyll, who you see down on the right here. Jekyll's designs blended native species and natural contours, as you can see in this garden here on the left, which is at Barrington Court in Somerset. Jekyll would have a profound impact on Farrand's style. So, Farrand had a firm foundation upon which to begin a career and was well on her way to becoming one of America's leading landscape designers, hence her inclusion in the ASLA, though even today, some ASLA officials debate whether or not she just slid in under the wire because she was, Edith Wharton's niece and blah, 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 and she had all these connections. She really wasn't qualified. She didn't have the experience enough. I shouldn't say she wasn't qualified. They just thought she didn't have the experience enough at the time. She was only 26. What have you done at 26, right? These old grizzled guys with beards and attitudes, right? But I think that she did have the experience, she had the eye, and she had done her homework already. Well, in any event, even though she was elected to the organization, she never liked the term landscape architect. If anything, the skill of the landscape gardener, as she preferred to call herself, was closer to that of a painter than a draftsman. A garden, large or small, must be treated in the impressionist manner, she wrote in Scribner's Magazine in 1907. Plants are to the gardener what his palette is to the painter. Farrand's artistic eye, coupled with her sympathetic incorporation of the surrounding natural landscape and fondness for the use of native plants, ultimately made her one of the most sought-after gardeners of her day. So over the course of her long and prosperous career, some 50-odd years, she designed the grounds at numerous college campuses such as Yale and Princeton, and national monuments such as the White House, as well as private gardens for a host of well-heeled clients, the Rockefellers and Roosevelts and whatnot, all the way from Maine to California. This is, at the top, this is Occidental College in Los Angeles, which she designed, and below is the East Colonial Garden at the White House, which she designed in 1913 for Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, President Woodrow Wilson's wife. It was replaced by Jacqueline Kennedy in the 1960s, totally redone. So it doesn't exist like that anymore. Now, among her many New England commissions, most were on Mount Desert Island, Maine, which is now home to the Beatrix Farrand Society. And it was also where she and her family used to go in the summertime. But of the dozen or so surviving Farrand gardens nationwide, Connecticut is fortunate to have 4, in addition to her work at Yale. So I'm going to say that again. There's only a dozen gardens that we know of that survived, that she designed, that are still intact. And 4 of them are right here in Connecticut. And 2 of them are practically within walking distance of here. Well, it depends if you want to go for a good walk. Maybe a short drive. But anyway, the 2 are at Harkness Memorial Park in Waterford, then one at Hill-Stead Museum up in Farmington, and then the last is at Three Rivers Farm in Bridgewater. Now, the Harkness Gardens, laid out in 1919, are considered by some garden historians to be among Farrand's most majestic gardens. They flank the east and west wings of Eolia, Edward S. and Mary Harkness's elegant Renaissance Revival summer mansion on Goshen Point, which is just west of New London, overlooking Long Island Sound. Harkness, by the way, who you see up here on the right, Harkness made his money the easy way by inheriting it from his father, and who was an early investor in Standard Oil. But to be fair, the old boy actually spent the rest of his life pretty much giving away his fortune to charitable causes, and mostly in Connecticut, including his alma mater, Yale. So think Harkness Tower, right? Harkness Memorial Quadrangle. They were named after Harkness here, who donated the money. Connections came in hand here again. Farrand met Harkness through her husband, Max Farrand, who was chairman of Yale's history department and director of the Commonwealth Fund, which was a Harkness family foundation. So that's how she got to know the Harkness family and got this commission. Now, her initial commission was to transform Aeolia's turf tennis court into an oriental garden for the Harknesses' collection of Asian sculpture, which you see. They enjoyed going to Asia, and they would buy art. It actually really wasn't very good art. It was kind of the stuff you'd buy like today in the gift shop at the airport. It was sort of not great stuff, but what did they know? They liked it, and they bought it, and they brought it home, and they put it out, and Beatrix Farrand used it in the garden. They asked her to make a kind of oriental sort of thing here for us. So what she did was she transformed this tennis court into an intimate space enclosed by a granite wall with grass pathways surrounding a sunken garden and a reflecting pool. Now, she dabbed the neatly trimmed beds with baby's breath, lavender, lilies, and roses, while she used hibiscus and other ornamental shrubs to define the perimeters, together with stalks of delphiniums. Now, this particular garden, was actually doubly blessed in that it was slightly modified 2 decades later by another leading woman landscape designer of Farrand's day, a woman by the name of Marion Kruger Coffin. So she came in later and dabbled with it a bit too, and made a couple of changes. But the basic design you see here is Farrand's. Now, delighted with the results, the Harknesses asked Farrand to reimagine the colorful but uninspired regimental plantings of the original West Garden. The original West Garden, whose design you can see here, had been designed by the architects of the house. They weren't landscape architects. They were home builders. They designed houses, and they just said, all right, well, here's going to be the garden, and we'll just put it right here. And they followed the same sort of traditional European grand mansion plan that had been around since Versailles. Very, very straight, boxy, regimental kind of plantings. Well, Beatrix Farrand had new and different ideas in mind. Retaining the garden's hippodrome shape, she increased the number of beds and softened their edges with, quote, swirled drifts of blues and expanding loosely circular patterns, as she later wrote. And she added dahlias that were supposed to be not too tall, as she wrote, and feathery flocks of white northern bedstraw and dozens of other species, including heliotrope, cuttings of which today are still known as Harkness heliotrope. A wisteria-shaded Italianate tea house and pergola anchored the garden's north end, while gravel pathways lead to a break in the southern wall and an emerald green expanse of lawn which billows down to the sea. And if you haven't been to Harkness, I'm sure a lot of you have, but if you haven't been there, it's a delightful, beautiful place to visit, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. You can sit there in that pergola, and it just invites you to get up and wander down, and you wander down and you wander out the wall and across the lawn, and there's Long Island Sound, and it's just beautiful. For a few final touches, she added a boxwood parterre, which is plantings arranged in a geometric design, as you can see here, as well as a little alpine rock garden. So there's a few little afterthoughts that are, I think look a little weird, but they're there nonetheless, and they do kind of work. Mary Harkness willed Aeolia to the state of Connecticut upon her death in 1950, which was very nice of her, of course. Unfortunately, she left no endowment to maintain the property. So, to give you an idea of what it took to run the 200-acre estate, it was a working farm that had chickens and dairy cows and a vegetable garden that supplied fresh produce to the family, both in Waterford and New York City. And the grounds included a 9-hole golf course and a garage that had housed 5 cars, 3 limousines, and a truck used to cart 1,500 pounds of ice to the house every other day during the summer. Property also had a windmill used to pump water into the home's 20,000-gallon water tank. So there's an awful lot of maintenance with no money. I don't know what it takes to run your house. It takes a lot to run mine. Think about a mansion like this with basically with no budget. So by the late 1980s, the gardens, which had once been tended by a staff of 40 gardeners, were choked over with weeds and just overgrown. Well, help arrived in 1992 with a campaign organized by the nonprofit Friends of Harkness Memorial State Park, together with the state, to restore the grounds and gardens to close approximations of Farrand's originals. Because gardens evolve over time, the Friends decided to focus on 1930, the year Farrand's plans would have been fully realized. Even though Farrand's drawings were at hand, the passage of time did not make the job of what's been called forensic gardening any easier. Plant species from Farrand's day, for instance, had since died out. Botanical plant names had changed, making them really difficult to identify. And volunteers spent hours scouring historical images, like you see on the left here, historical images of the gardens with magnifying glasses to try and zero in and see just what is that little thing there? What kind of plant is that? In order to recognize a particular species. And they also had to go through, if they found something or they found some written reference, they'd have to go back and look up in old seed catalogs and track those down to see, well, what were they called back then? Is there any kind, and then try and follow that along to see what they were now called something else. It was an amazing bit of detective work on their part. In addition to the gardens, the mansions got a $3.8 million renovation, and today, hundreds of visitors a day enjoy the gardens and the grounds, especially during wedding season, as opposed to weeding season. Oh, sorry about that. But as I say, it's just a beautiful, lovely place, well tended by now these nonprofit, these very dedicated volunteers, God bless them, who show up and try and keep this place up and running and looking as beautiful as possible, considering their limitations. Now, caretakers of the Hill-Stead farm in Farmington, Connecticut, faced a similar forensic gardening challenge, though they were working from a Farrand plan for a garden that technically never even existed. How is that possible? Well, Hill-Stead was the brainchild of Theodate Pope Riddle. She lived from 1867 to 1946. And she was a headstrong Miss Porter's School alumna, a Lusitania survivor, and a distinguished American architect. She was actually the first woman architect to be licensed in both Connecticut and New York. And she was born in Ohio, and she fell in love with the Farmington countryside as a schoolgirl when she went to Miss Porter's. So in 1901, she moved into a Mount Vernon-inspired farmhouse that you can see here on the right, which she designed on a 250-acre estate, and she amassed the estate by just buying up farms around her. Just kept buying them, expanding out and buying these farms from farmers who didn't want to work them anymore or just said, oh, sure, I'll take the money. And so she cobbled together all these farms into a 250-acre estate. And the farm was ostensibly a retirement property for her parents, but it became, in fact, Theodate's personal Shangri-La. While her father filled the walls of the main house with his collection of French Impressionist paintings, Theodate, and that name is a very powerful name, I think it means God does things my way. I think that's what it means. But she spent her time meticulously directing the transformation of the rustic Yankee landscape into a classic English dairy farm, down to the smallest detail. She forbade power mowers, insisting, quote, that all lawns be cut by hand mowers and that the grass be kept shaggy, or around 2 inches in height, which was her idea of a proper British lawn. That's the quote from a gardener who worked for her later on. There would be hell to pay if she spied a dandelion or a buttercup on one of her walks around the property, and the groundskeepers routinely weeded the main lawn on their knees. And here you can see some of the members of the happy crew here, probably just before they all quit, I would imagine. But Theodate, who married American diplomat John W. Riddle in 1916, had a sunken garden created for her mother, Ada, in a natural bowl-like depression near the southern entrance of the house. Inspired by the gardens of Monticello, it featured neat boxwood-lined brick pathways and a sundial and beds of foxgloves, hollyhocks, roses, and lilies. At the center was an octagonal, open-sided summer house that provided shade and a quiet spot for tea and conversation on sultry afternoons. Now, Theodate probably met Farrand in 1912, when Farrand was hired to plan a garden for the Westover School in Middlebury, which was also one of Theodate's clients. She was doing some architectural work for the school, and Farrand was hired to do some of the landscape stuff, and so they met and hit it right off. After her mother's death in 1920, Theodate asked Farrand to redesign the sunken garden, so redesign the garden that she'd done for her mother. But for some reason, she never moved forward with the plans. She just never went ahead with the job. During the 1940s, the garden ended up getting turfed over completely, and Theodate, by then in her 80s, had kind of lost her zest for gardening and ran out of steam. So by the time of her death in 1946, the property became a museum, and Farrand's plans for the garden were all but forgotten. Nobody remembered them anymore. Then in 1984, two local garden clubs decided to revive Hill-Stead's gardens. Work on the sunken garden was about to get underway when the husband of a board member noted a reference to the unused Farrand plan in a catalog of Farrand's work at the University of California at Berkeley, where Farrand's papers are archived. They're there because her husband actually ended up going out there and teaching, or running a library, I should say. And so her papers ended up there. At that point, everything stopped, recalled the landscaper in charge of the project. She sent for the Farrand design, and the decision was made to use this plan here that you see, instead, creating a garden that up to that point had existed only on paper and in Farrand's imagination. It was really quite fascinating to see the way she changed the spatial relationships of the original gardener, said New Haven-based landscape architect Siobhan Towers, who had firsthand knowledge of Farrand's work by restoring much of it at Yale. So Towers was the gardener who was put in charge of this project. Her walkways were larger than the original. Her bed layouts addressed the topographic configuration of the bowl in a much more sympathetic way, and her color palette was much more sophisticated. Today, the garden blooms with the soft pastel shades of phlox, iris, lavender, and other perennials Farrand would have known, including heliotrope, which comes from Harkness. It's maybe 90% of what she had in mind, speculated Hill-Stead's garden manager, Leanne Moran, who said that updating the garden to Farrand's original plan is an ongoing process. So they've done as best the job as they can, imagining what it would have looked, because some of the things had to come along and whatnot. I'm sure those of you who garden know that you got to wait for things to happen, and sometimes they don't, and you got to start over again or whatever. So, but they had Farrand's plan, and so they followed it as best they could, with the same kind of forensic work that they had to do at Harkness. Now, a similar horticultural treasure hunt took place at Three Rivers Farm, the country home of Dr. Frederick Peterson in the former village of Chepaug near Bridgewater. It's Peterson on the right here. He was a preeminent Manhattan neurologist and a colleague of Carl Jung. And he knew Farrand from New York, where she designed a small garden for him at his office on West 50th Street in 1909. It's not there anymore. As for her garden at Three Rivers, well, it was thought to have similarly disappeared years ago. That was until 1992, when garden historian Pamela Edwards of nearby Roxbury happened to consult the same catalog that led to the Hill-Stead discovery and noticed the Peterson property among Farrand's commissions for 1921. It listed all the work that she did, year by year. And this woman, Pamela Edwards, said, "Well, hang on. In 1921, she designed a garden here." So at the time of the discovery, the house was in the hands of Promisek Incorporated, which is a group of local citizens who purchased the farm in 1978 to rescue it from development. The word Promisek is an Indian word. It's loosely translated as the land he walks on forever, or land that goes on forever. So their purpose was to preserve this place, to keep it from becoming another mall or something. Now, the space behind the rambling, clapboard farmhouse appeared to be nothing more than a tangled, thorny pit of wild raspberries and bittersweet, which kind of sounds like my backyard. But still, Edwards could recognize Farrand's hand through the mess. So with the help of a small grant and a cadre of volunteers, she began exhuming Connecticut's fourth existing Farrand garden. What gradually emerged was a rectangular walled garden that, according to Farrand's original plan, once bloomed with lamb's ears, phlox, hosta, and tea roses, together with various oriental species, such as Japanese lilac, which was favored by Peterson. Peterson, like the Harknesses, he also enjoyed traveling to Asia. It was kind of a big thing, I guess, back then, go to Asia. And so it had some Asian influences in the garden as well. I know it's a little hard to see that. At Promisek, they gave me a lovely digitized version. So this is their digitized version of Farrand's plans, which made it a little easier for them to work from to recreate the gardens. So anyway, this is Farrand's plan, what Promisek did to kind of interpret it and make it easier to work from, and there it is. One unique feature of the Promisek garden is that it was something of a forerunner to one of Farrand's most famous and magnificent creations, the fabulous Oriental-themed Abbey, Aldrich, Rockefeller garden in Seal Harbor, Maine, which begun in 1926. The Promisek gardener, Irene Meltzer, when I went there and interviewed her, told me that there are a lot of elements that you see in that garden up in Maine that you first see used here in Promisek. So Farrand had these things in mind and incorporated them into this much bigger, enormous, elaborate garden up in Maine that she did for the Rockefellers. Now, many of Farrand's surviving gardens continue to be enjoyed and cared for by hundreds of volunteers and dedicated gardening enthusiasts from Connecticut to California. 2014, she was honored by the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame as an inductee. So in closing, thank you very much. And I encourage you all to go to Harkness if you haven't been. Even if you have been, go back and see how they're doing. Go back several times.